Welcome back to Arthurian April, friends, and today we're going to go back in time and do day 18 because I was traveling for over 24 hours yesterday and not possible. Today we are going to be talking about a very famous couple, and no, we're not talking about Tristan and Isolde, and we are also not talking about Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, or however you want to figure that part out. We are going to talk about Erec and Enide. They are one of the oldest couples in the stories of King Arthur, and in fact appear in Colic and Olwen, but most famously in the first romance in Chrétien de Troyes' collection. What is particularly interesting to me about that story is twofold. One, there is a woman in the title. It's not very often in the romances that we actually get a woman's name, let alone one in the actual title of the story. But they're also married. The first part of the romance goes into detail about how they got together, how Erec was doing his knightly duties and came across this very beautiful but very down on her luck in terms of monetary value young Enide, who is a attendant to a noble and is so taken by her beauty and her charm and her faithfulness and her courage that he falls in love with her, and before you know it, they are married and living together. Don't let that fool you into thinking that this is some incredible feminist comment, because there are definitely some challenging topics in this poem and a lot of debate that's been had by critics over the years. So we can't quite go that level, but it is also a really fascinating look at the roles of men and women in this time in the constructs of marriage. So once they've gotten married, that's where the interesting trials come in. And if you're a fan of any classical literature, you'll know that this is a conceit that we see quite often. Someone is worried, usually, that his wife is not being faithful or something is amiss, and they must go through some trials together to either prove her fidelity or to figure out what exactly is going on. In Erec and Enide, it's a little bit of a misunderstanding. Essentially, they're so happy in their marriage that poor Erec is pretty much avoiding his knightly duties, and she feels guilty. Enide feels guilty about this, and he overhears her talking about it and thinks that means she's not being faithful to him, and they go on this adventure together. First, you're going, oh, holy cow, there's a woman going on an adventure instead of staying in her castle and being beautiful and whatever. But it's a little more complicated than that. They have to go through a series of trials, and the only rule that Erec lays down is that his wife cannot speak. If you're thinking, wow, that should be a problem, you're completely right, because it turns out that Erec tends to get himself into a lot of trouble. And because he keeps getting himself into trouble, poor Enide is having to constantly break her vow by shouting, warning him, making sure that he's not completely disemboweled or injured because he's not paying attention. There has been a lot of discussion over what this actually means. Is it sort of supporting this idea that Enide and women in general are way smarter and their husbands are incapable, and if it's not for them, that they wouldn't survive because of their silly rules? Or is this sort of a longer treatise on how women can't follow directions no matter what, and regardless of the situation, they're always going to figure their way around it? And yes, Enide is very, very often talked about in terms of her physical beauty. She's even described very traditionally with her golden locks of hair and her beautiful bright eyes. If you read a lot of romances from this era, you see there's definitely a formula. But what's a little bit different is that even though she is beautiful, she is the impoverished daughter of a vavasor. And a vavasor, which is a very, very old word, is essentially the sort of local landlord to other vassals. So they're sort of super, 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 super minor nobility, but they're in charge of kind of keeping the tenants happy and organized for the lord. But in this particular case, their family has fallen on hard times. So her innate nobility is sort of negated. And even so, she is considered very, very wise, as I said, very courageous, very faithful. Her family is from very minor means, but they very much value her. And that is seen as a very positive thing. In addition, when you see her description written out, it's actually much closer to the way they describe princesses and queens in these kinds of romances. So it's kind of nice. She's not just beautiful, she's also inherently noble of spirit, which makes me think that the larger conversation around this particular story, because surprise, surprise, everything turns out okay in the end, and they figure out some kind of balance, is also about the sort of cleverness of women, that even breaking the rules, they are actually saving their husbands' butts. Because Erec honestly is kind of a jerk. He clearly doesn't know what he's got. From a fashion historian perspective, like much of Chrétien, there's a lot of discussion about the kinds of clothes people wear and commentary to let the reader or the listener be able to kind of make assumptions about their particular state. When they describe the clothing that Enide and her family are wearing, it's very clear that these are humble garments, that their house is strewn with humble carpets. And there's a lot of symbolism later on when Guinevere is so taken by Enide and her wonderful innate nobility that she actually clothes her in a gown from her own court. So she's essentially robed in the actual garb of a queen herself. I particularly love that this is a married couple, and even in modern romance, this is not something that you see that often. It's all about the chase, it's all about getting married or connecting or whatever. So, as a married person myself, I find it really fascinating that we're watching the story unfold, but also following past that moment of connection of the characters into something more. The story of Erec and Enide is many times told, but never quite got the traction in more popular culture, so it's very rare to find them in any kind of modern retelling, but they're there occasionally, including in my stories, as some sort of background characters. In my version, they live in Avilion, and you see Erec at least one point. But anyway, from the 12th century to now, a married couple fraught with challenges, but managing to rise above it, and a female character that actually found her way into the title. You don't see that every day.